everyone. You're almost welcome to the third installment of the Ouroboros Seminar, the seminar that is dedicated to the exploration of life and work of the Chilean biologist, cognitive scientist, and philosopher Francisco Varela. It's a beautiful morning here in Ljubljana, Slovenia, and I hope you're having a great day, or you had a great day wherever you are. First, again, a few short words about the series itself. This might be particularly useful to those who are joining us perhaps for the first time via YouTube. So this year's Ouroboros Seminar is organized jointly by the research group in the making Metanoia, Mind and Life Europe, and we have a newly added partner, Faculty of Arts, University of Ljubljana. The seminar itself is a part of a broader initiative, as you probably know, which was started by Mind and Life Europe and which centers around two special anniversaries, namely the 20th anniversary of Francisco passing and the 30th anniversary of the publication of the Embodied Mind. A few very short words about the structure of the seminar. Each seminar consists of 20 to 40 minute presentation of a selected paper, or as is the case today, of two selected papers. And after that, we have an approximately 60 to 90 minute discussion. I will be moderating the discussion, and I was notified that it might not be a bad idea to introduce myself. So my name is Sebastjan Vörös. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy from at the University of Ljubljana. The way you pose questions is that you simply paste them in the general chat. So you just write them down in a general chat. We've agreed that we're going to try out this method instead of you posting the questions via a personal message to me, so that other participants can also see your questions. And I would kindly ask you to keep the questions short, clear, and to the point, or at least as much as this is possible, of course. Now, due to time constraints, I am and will not be probably able to take all the questions. And for this reason, and also because some people have expressed their interest in this, we have created a special Discord channel, which you are all kindly and warmly invited to join, where all the discussions can be continued, expanded, elaborated upon. So if there are any questions that, for example, I will not be able to answer, or if there are any questions that pop up later on as you ruminate over the last presentation, then please join the Discord channel and consider continuing discussing the topic there. You will find all the relevant necessary information at the Metanoia and Mind and Life website, so make sure you check them out. Now, today we have a special guest, Tom Froese. Have I pronounced this correctly, or at least semi-correctly, Tom?
That's fine. That's how it sounds in German.
Okay, marvelous. So Tom Froese is a cognitive scientist with a background in computer science and complex systems. He investigates the interactive basis of life and mind with a variety of methods, including evolutionary robotics, agent-based modeling, sensory substitution interfaces, artificial neural networks, and virtual reality. He is particularly known for his contributions to the field of artificial life and to the enactive approach to cognitive science. Tom will be presenting two papers today, namely Autonomy and Autopoiesis from 1981 and Steps to a Cybernetics of Autonomy from 1986. So two papers from 1980s, which are still very much imbued with ideas taken from the cybernetic tradition and incorporate and combine different different approaches and thought styles that Francisco was experimenting with back then. So, Tom, at this point, I would kindly ask you if you wouldn't mind to just, maybe say a few words about yourself, what you're currently doing, where you're currently positioned, and then maybe we can slowly move on to today's presentation.
All right, thank you very much, Sebastjan, for the invitation and for the introduction. I have to admit, I got more nervous than I expected preparing for this lecture. I said, of course, I can talk about a couple of Varela papers, that should be enough. But then as I started working through them, somehow I started, reliving my career or something like that, saying, hey, I was a PhD student when I was reading these papers and what has happened since then. So, it's quite an interesting experience revisiting these papers. So right now, I'm the head of the Embodied Cognitive Science unit at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology here in Japan. And one of the missions of our unit is to try to make use of the recent advances in theoretical cognitive science and philosophy of mind, and see whether we can turn them into experimental approaches. And I think that, that's very much in the spirit of Francisco Varela's research program. And there are lots of exciting things happening here that today won't be the topic, but I hope that I can, at least through a kind of critical reading of these papers, give you a sense of where I feel the future direction of the enactive approach lies. And then these papers are a nice kind of transition point between the work that we discussed in the previous seminars of the series, and I think the things that will happen later on. So let me just start my screen share. What I will do is give you an insight into how I read papers by showing you what I did with them. Let me just open the Outlook. So can everybody see that? Yeah. Okay.
That's marvelous.
All right. Thank you. So I will start with the paper from 1981, and then I will go to the next one. So I'm going to kind of highlight a few things and discuss them in a way that I think highlights some of the interesting tensions that that Varela was exploring here. And I'm really reading these papers now. I can kind of see his restlessness somehow through these papers of having some insights that have more to do with the experiential side of what he was working with in those days, and looking for formalism to be able to express them, and not really being happy with the kinds of formalisms that he was working with. So this will be one of the recurring themes that I want to bring out when we look at these papers. So the first one, Autonomy and Autopoiesis, starts off by being basically a kind of corrective to the literature in which he wants to clarify a distinction between autopoiesis and autonomy. And the motivation for that is that the concept of autopoiesis started to become quite popular, and it started being applied to a whole host of phenomena. And by doing so, it kind of lost a little bit of the original definition, which was mainly targeted as at the metabolic single cell level. So he basically thought that it would be important to keep that word autopoiesis for this original domain, the chemical domain of the living, and still acknowledge that there are other kinds of systems that should exhibit similar kinds of properties, but then to call those autonomous. So here in the first page, I made a little diagram on the left. So we can think of autopoiesis as being a very specific instance of an autonomous system. And we can see a little bit his frustration with people being not careful enough to distinguish it. So he says, it has been consistently confused and left unclarified. And one of the comments I have here, why is this an important problem? Right? This is something that I think we should think about, because if it's just a definitional thing, right? The name autopoiesis should only be used for the chemical domain. Well, if that's all that is, well, why is it such a big deal? Are we really arguing just about labels, or is there something deeper going on here? And we see the same kind of frustration here on the next section when he talks about organizational closure as a generalization of autopoiesis, whereby we basically have a network of processes that recursively generates itself. And he says that for people who are applying these ideas to social systems, they make category mistakes. And again, I think it's quite a strong term to use here. It's not like he's saying that I want to use the label autopoiesis only for living systems, so please don't use it elsewhere. Category mistake, is something like the homunculus problem, right? So there we talk about category mistakes in that sense, that we shouldn't attribute personal level characteristics to neurons, for example. So why, again, is he using this strong language here? And I think it has to do with the fact that he has something special in mind for autopoiesis, which has to do with the kind of embodiment that living systems have, which distinguish them from the kind of autonomy that other systems might exhibit. He doesn't say it explicitly in this paper, but I think that's what the sense I get from why this is an important issue for him. Because if you think about the way in which he defines organizational closure down here, right? An organizational closed unit is defined as a composite unity by a network of interactions of components that, one, through their interactions recursively regenerate the network of interactions that produce them, and two, realize the network as a unity in the space in which the components exist by constituting and specifying the unity's boundaries as a cleavage from the background. So it's kind of like one of those versions of how to define autonomy. But what I note here is that if we just replace the word space here with chemical domain, basically we got autopoiesis, a definition of autopoiesis. There's not much else here that would differentiate this definition from a definition of autopoiesis. So again, it's interesting that he makes a big deal that we should separate them, but then it just seems to be, when you closely look at it, just a matter of the domain in which things are applied. And then the question is, why is that so important? Why is it so important that the domain of the living is giving the special place that it deserves a label of its own, which is autopoiesis, whereas the rest belongs to a different kind of category? Right, so he gives some implications of organizational closure. And one of the other things that struck me in this paper, but rereading it, is that he's actually flirting quite closely with the computational approach. And it appears at several points to this paper. One of them here is that he's actually so inclusive that he would admit general computations of any kind, whether natural or man-made, as possible instances of organizational closure. General computations of any kind. Wow, I mean, reading some of his later work where he's quite, distancing himself from a computational approach, this sounds very permissive, right? And we can think about, even a Turing machine facing the halting problem, right? So there's a network of processes running on the computer, which recursively regenerates the processes that are running on the computer because it can never stop, never stop, never stop, right? So this kind of recursive self-generating network of processes, should we call that autonomous, right? And if that's the case, then where's really the boundary here? Then this distinction between computation and autonomy starts to blur a little bit, right? And he even admits here that if we consider organizational closure in the physical space, it becomes identical with autopoiesis, right? So it's an identity relationship in this case, and it's a very strong claim. That would really mean that the only difference between autopoiesis of the living and, let's say, autonomy of a social system or autonomy of a Turing machine or whatever you might want to consider is only its material instantiation, right? And that gets into questions of multiple realizability and things like that in the philosophy of mind. So he doesn't spell it out here, but I think we can get a sense that there's something important to him about living matter, right? And he cannot put his finger quite yet on what it is about living matter that makes it special, but he wants to reserve a special place for it, just by making these kind of very, very neat distinctions, terminologically speaking. All right, so moving on. So here are some echoes of not one, not two, where he talks about how to define this kind of system. And he says the situation is peculiar in that the describer cannot step outside of the unity to consider its boundaries in an environment simultaneously, but it is associated with the unity's function always as a determinant component, right? So it's, yes, we can describe these things and in that sense be a little bit distant from it, right? Have an outside perspective on it, but at the same time, we're already always present and interdependent with the things that we're describing. So that's a nice kind of, and not one, not two reference here. And then he goes on to say that this is, properly speaking, the hermeneutic circle of interpretation action on which all human activity is based. And the notion of hermeneutic circle here, reappears, of course, through all of this work later on. And I think Evan Thompson at one point said somewhere that originally Francisco Varela actually thought about naming the enactive approach the hermeneutic approach. So, it's quite closely related here. So we can already see it here in 81, moving into that direction of what will then become the enactive approach. All right, so some problems. And this maybe stems a little bit from still drawing quite a lot on the autopoietic tradition that he developed with Umberto Maturana. He says here that such a domain is a domain of descriptive interactions relative to the environment as beheld by the observer, that is, a cognitive domain for the unity. Now, I have two issues here. One is that when we separate things so neatly, right, we basically follow the doctrine of non-intersecting domains, which was part of the original autopoietic tradition, where on the one hand, you have a unity, and then you can look at that as a network of processes or network of components. But if you look at it as a unity, the unity as a unity, then you're in a different domain, and that is the domain of relations or interactions with this environment, right? So this is the kind of distinction that is at play here. But then there are two things, right? There's one perspective, which is the observer's perspective, something beheld by the observer. And then there's another perspective, which is the one for the unity, right? But it seems like, in this case at least, the perspective for the unity, the cognitive domain for the unity, is actually something that only exists relative to the observer's perspective, which then makes me think that phrasing things in this way makes it hard to attribute an intrinsic perspective to the unity, right? It's kind of like saying, if I see other people around me, yes, I can treat them as if they have a cognitive domain of their own, but actually really, the only reason why I can say that is because of my own cognitive domain. It's kind of like a self, referred kind of cognitive domain, not one that refers intrinsically to the other subjects. And probably Maturana would be happy with that. It's a kind of like conventional way of thinking about cognition. But definitely, later on, at least, by the time we talk about Hans Jonas and so on in Varela's work, at that point, the intrinsic perspective, is a core part of what the enactive approach is about. But here still, it's not quite clear whether that's actually something on the agenda or not. All right, here, again, very interestingly, some flirtations with the computational approach. So he has the closure thesis, every autonomous system is organizationally closed. And he says, in this sense, it's similar to Church's thesis in the theory of computation, a kind of heuristic, where the vague notion of computability is made equivalent to that of recursive function. So I just have a little comment at the bottom where I say, so computation, according to Church's thesis, is more or less equal to recursive function. And his closure thesis says that autonomy is more or less a recursive generation, right? So it's this network of processes that regenerates, its own network of processes. So if you boil it down to this, right, then the key move that has been done here is not necessarily to really overturn the computationalist program, but to just generalize it and say, we're not just talking about functions anymore, we're talking about processes, and process of production is one particular instance of that. So it's interesting that, at least in a formal way, it seems that there's a strong similarity between these research programs, although sometimes we're quite keen on separating them. If we go back to these early papers, we can see that, he's not ashamed to cite this Church thesis as one way of thinking about what he's trying to do here, right? So something to keep in mind. Then he has a few examples of organizational closure. And of course, the most important one will be cellular systems, which this is in the chemical domain. This is where autopoiesis, comes from. And then we have his work on the immune system, and then we have the nervous system. So looking at these a little bit more closely, I think actually these do not form one set. Right? The first two are actually, maybe we can consider one set in the sense that both talk about material production. Right? In one case, the components are molecules. We can think about proteins or something like that in a cell. And in the other case, in the immune system, the components are clones of lymphocytes or antibodies or these kinds of and other kinds of physical components. So in both cases, we have examples of recursive productions, recursive material productions. And then the move comes to the nervous system. And he says here the components are neurons or, more aggregate cortical columns. I had to think there for a moment because I don't think that that's actually an example of a material production. It's not the case that the neural firing activity or the dynamics or even the chemical interaction between neurons has the effect of creating neurons or columns of whole neurons, right? I mean, potentially, if there's some sort of like, generation of new neurons, they might also depend on activity of the rest of the nervous system. But in general, that's not what he's talking about here. He's really talking about neural activity. So it's quite curious to see him talking here as components being neurons, physical components, rather than something more dynamic. Right, so in my mind, the problem here is that once we acknowledge that we're not talking about material production, but maybe something like dynamics production or generation, then we're starting to slip from this notion of recursive generation, which is the autonomy idea, to something quite close to recursive function, which actually is a generalization of Church's thesis of computation, right? So again, some interesting warning bells are like, ringing in my head when I see this kind of move. And presumably, even for Francisco Varela, he must have had some second thoughts about, exactly what was going on here. And who knows, maybe these kinds of subtle distinctions is exactly why he was interested to separate, on the one hand, autonomy in the material domain and autonomy in other domains. All right. At the bottom, he has an interesting statement. This form of autonomy is coupled to, but not identical with, the autonomy of the whole organism where the immune system exists. So I just highlighted that one because it kind of points ahead to one of the future seminars where we will discuss the organism as a meshwork of selfless cells, right? So this idea of multiple forms of autonomous systems coming together to form one organism is already present here. Okay, so this idea that, what's the relationship here? Going from recursive production to generation to function, I said, it seems a little bit like a way of generalizing the Church thesis. And, he comes very close to saying the same thing himself. He says, in a sense, the idea of organizational closure generalizes the classical notion of stability of a system that cybernetics inherited from classical mechanics proposed in the 1930s. So it's like the recursive generation that is at the heart of the definition of autonomy is a broader category that includes in it recursive functions. We can think about what's exactly the difference between these two. Maybe some recursive generations cannot be easily described as functions. This will be one way of interpreting it, right? Maybe some things that are happening at the metabolic level can easily be captured in a functionalist way. But again, it's interesting that it's actually a relatively small step, right? We're saying we're taking on board, notions of stability from cybernetics and going back to classical mechanics like Newtonian dynamics, things like that, and just adding a little bit more to that and saying now we're talking about biological systems or social systems using those same frameworks that originally were developed for physics. So here's one example of this kind of function, right? So we have a function f, and then there's a relationship between the different elements of the function. So yeah, I mean, he even talks about this can be cashed out in terms of stability and state space analysis and so on. So it's to some extent a little bit like what we would nowadays call the dynamical systems approach to cognition. I think this is kind of the thing that we're seeing here. But famously, for main defenders of the dynamical approach to cognition, like Randall Beer, it's famously incapable of capturing autopoiesis, for example, or self-production more generally. And so for Randall Beer, for example, he explicitly abstracts away from the level of metabolic self-production and then situates his dynamical approach on top of that and just assumes that the agent is already a materially existing unity. Here's another interesting reference to the paper that Louis Kaufmann discussed about the calculus of self-reference. So Varela himself makes reference to this. And I think in this paper, we can understand a little bit the motivation of why he was going in that direction. So, in his mind, what he's doing is generalizing this kind of dynamical systems framework to not just be recursive functions, but recursion in general as applied to living or social systems. But he has one key problem, and that is that when you just look at it in terms of Newtonian dynamics, there's no notion of boundary. Right? He says it there. It is a key aspect of his formalization, but not the only one. The boundary aspect is not explicitly taken into account. And so now, looking at it from that point of view, we can see why he was so interested in formalizing distinctions, right? At a foundation level, I have presented my views about this in terms of the basic act of distinction. And then he talks about the calculus of self-reference there. So in the diagram that I put above, one way of thinking about what's going on here is that he takes the recursive function formalism of Church thesis to some extent, tries to combine it with, a calculus of distinctions, and in that way introduce a boundary condition, which then allows him to talk about recursive generation in the way that he needs in order to formalize organizational closure. So that's one way of thinking about how these two different branches of his formalism come together, right? You have the dynamics of recursion on the one hand, which is a generalization of just functional recursion. And on the other hand, you have his more graphical notation work, which gives him a way of thinking about boundaries and identity and distinction. Okay. All right. So coming up to the end of this first paper, some other interesting things that surprised me reading them now is that he traces this idea of closure. So on the one hand, he was tracing it to Newtonian dynamics, but on the other hand, he's tracing it here. He says it's rooted in the work of people working in the semantics of computer languages. I think for some people this might come quite shocking, right? I mean, this is like GoFi almost, like that's how, cybernetics broke apart, and then good old-fashioned AI started up, doing this kind of thing about trying to implement semantics in machines and things like that. So it's interesting that he says that this idea of eigenbehaviors is rooted in that work. So maybe someone should take another closer look at that. And he says it has the great advantage of not being couched in the quantitative framework required by differentiable dynamics, right? So differential equations. And thus being more close to systems exhibiting autonomy above the thermodynamic context of physical interactions. So this is really fascinating to me because later on, I put this in the diagram on the left here. Later on, when he gets into the neurophenomenology of time consciousness, which is really, to my mind, the flagship project of his mature career, we've got a complete inversion of what he writes here, which is to say, when you look at his differentiation of timescales, right? We've got the 1/10-second timescale, we've got the 1 second timescale, and we've got the 10-second timescale. And the first one is called the one of elementary events. So these are just firing potentials of neurons. Then the 1 second scale is where he spent most of his career in the neurophenomenology, working on large scale neural integration to explain cognitive acts, cognitive moments, that the experience of the present moment, right? But he captures them using dynamical systems theory. Right? At that time, that was his main tool, trying to develop a dynamical systems theory framework that would allow him to capture the recursive aspects of these fast timescales. And there is the 10-second timescale. He mentions it in the papers, but it's not really discussed in any detail. And that's the narrative descriptive timescale, he calls it, which deals with semantics, right? So it's like at the end of his career, all the focus has gone to the quantitative dynamics of the fast time processes that are closer to the physical time scale, but he didn't really delve any deeper into this narrative semantic time scale that would be a little bit above these other processes. So I just leave that there for discussion if anybody wants to comment on that. I'm really curious what people think about why, whereas here he emphasizes the advantage of working in a formalism that deals with semantics, later on the 10-second narrative timescale actually doesn't really make any strong appearance in his work anymore. All right, so then moving to the conclusions. So again, we have this issue of the non-intersecting domains. I already mentioned it, so that you know, he just says that these are inseparably distinct, you know, the inside and the outside, yet bridged by the hand that draws them. And it reminds me a little bit of not one, not two. So there's a bridge here, and the hand that draws them sounds like an action, right? So I thought at the moment, like when I read this, okay, he's talking experientially, there's no problem here, right? We can formally distinguish them and then they're neatly distinct, but actually in our own experience, there's no issue here. We are both, you know, our bodies and we're also our environment integrated into each other. But it's kind of like there are some tensions here, right? So he says autonomy and control do a continuous dance. And then at the bottom, he says the way the system is identified and specified is not separable from its cognitive performance. That almost seems like a direct contradiction to the statement that they're inseparably distinct, right? I mean, inseparably but distinct, I mean, it's getting a little bit confusing here. So this is the way I would try to argue how this problem arises. And that is that to some extent, both of these positions, the one that says everything is on the inside and the other position says that everything is on the outside, are both forms of internalism, actually. They just have a different role in terms of what is the relationship between the inside and the outside. They both agree that the most important part is on the inside, right? But where they differ is whether the relationship to the outside is one of correspondence, as he says here, which would be the representationalist paradigm, or whether it's one of consistency, which would be, you know, his preferred choice, perhaps, and which is also the one that we would hear when we look at constructivism of van Glaserfels or Heinz von Förster and the cybernetics. But you know, if the debate is between correspondence and consistency, what's not at the stake here is whether internalism at all is the right starting point or not, or whether we should actually, you know, just give up on this, you know, distinction between inner and outer to begin with. So again, I think that this is an interesting point also because this is something that some critics of the enactive approach, even nowadays, you know, sometimes throw at the enactive approach and say, hey, you're still locked inside the head, you know, even though you don't want to be representationalist, you're still internalist, right? So you can see some of this here in this early work. Right, and he concludes by saying that, you know, these ideas highlight the importance of interpretive phenomena proper to many continental traditions. However, they do so in the context of biological function, right? And so, yeah, to my mind, you know, it's prefiguring the neurophenomenology where you bring in Husserl and Merleau-Ponty and all these things and tie them together with a kind of organism-centered biology. All right, so that's the 81 paper. Let me just move on to the next one. So this one is called Steps to Cybernetics of Autonomy. And I think it's a write-up of a conference paper. And we also have a little bit of the debate that happened between him and the attendees that I will also comment on. And so we have, again, this idea here, right? On the left, internalism, if that's our starting point, it seems like we have two options. One is constructivism, in which we say, hey, we don't have a God's eye perspective, so we can't actually, you know, make sure that the inner matches the outer. So there's no correspondence, so we can't verify the correspondence. Or if you say, hey, there must be some correspondence, that's representationalism, and then you have, you know, different ways of trying to argue for why we should accept this kind of correspondence. So the notion of to create their world, you know, at the time when I was a PhD student, I was more in favor of a constructivist reading of this. But I think that, and it's not just me, but if you ask Evan Thompson and Ezekiel DiPaolo and others working in Enaction today, we're quite careful not to try to go towards this kind of direction, because it's a kind of, it ends up often in a kind of solipsistic position where everything else is just a projection of your own mind. And that's definitely not something that Varela wanted to endorse. So we have to be a little bit careful with how to interpret these kinds of statements. But for people who want to throw things at us, this is kind of like fodder for them, right? What, to create your own world? I mean, yeah, of course you're solipsists, right? So we have to be a little bit careful here. Right, so he has some motions here of Turing machines. And this paper, he seems to be already a little bit more distant from the kind of computationalism that he didn't seem to be so against in the previous paper, right? So he sees in the Turing machine the ultimate evolution of the notion of Cartesian causality, right? And of course, the Cartesian anxiety is one of those things in the embodied mind that he wants to get rid of. He says also that system theory as it developed today is incomplete. It is incapable to actually encompass the totality of the relevant biological phenomenology. And what it leaves aside is the quality of autonomy, and that organisms have their internal determination. And here my question is, I think what's happening here is that he has a strong sense that the current way of how we deal with organisms is insufficient, and that we need something else. And partially it's insufficient because it cannot capture the being of organisms, the lived experience of who we are. And the best way he can express it at that moment is to talk about internal determination. But internal in what sense, right? Again, is it internal spatially speaking, right? Inside my skin, is that what we're talking about? Or inside my head? Or organizationally speaking, is it inside the network of organizational closure? Or do we mean internal just as a kind of metaphorical sense for subjectively speaking, like actually in consciousness? Is that the kind of internal that we want to speak about here? And I think it's a little bit ambiguous exactly what kind of internal is at play here. But we're just reading the text directly. It seems to be mainly almost a spatial thing. Like I said, internalism is something that doesn't seem to be really questioned yet. He's going to talk about two basic issues: self-determination, all right? So it's kind of like autopoiesis, and then the emergence of meaning. And here we can see the sense-making is starting to make an appearance. These two pillars of the enactive approach make an appearance here. These two qualities are completely outside, cannot be fit into the model or mechanism captured by the Turing machine, and I would say by any system. But interestingly, he's very strongly now against the Turing machine as being an adequate model of what he's trying to talk about. But the question is, of course, we saw in the previous paper how close the formalism of organizational closure actually was to the Turing machine. Remember Church's theses and computation and recursive functions and so on. And here he really, really wants to say that that's not going to work. But what happened in between? This is 5 years later. So what is it now that makes him think that this is no longer possible? I think this is like one of the key questions. And I'm not sure he really understands properly yet at this point why it's not working anymore. He just has the sense that he needs something else. All right. So here's, again, this my kind of worry about internalism, right? If we think of the organism as organizationally closed, either at the level of the nervous system or as an entire living body, what becomes of inputs then, he asks? We have shifted our emphasis. They are not something that is explicitly given, but inputs become simply a background of perturbations, which are undefined background noise. They do not enter into the definition of the machine, system, or procedure. Right? This to me is super radical now. I mean, think about it, right? There's the world, and including all you people on Zoom, like interacting with me, right? That's then reduced to inputs to me, and that actually then gets introduced to background noise that just perturbs me. And on that basis, somehow, I have to project out the world in order to reconstruct what I'm perceiving right now. I mean, that's very far removed from the kind of enactive approach that we're working on at the moment, which, we talk about co-determination and mutual constraints and extended mind and situated cognition and a relational approach and so on. Here, everything gets reduced to inputs of perturb, like background noise. So yeah, just throwing it out there, we can talk about, why he felt to talk about it in this way later. So the notion of Umwelt makes an appearance here. Sebastjan will be happy to hear. So he talks about eigenbehaviors that will specify out of the noise what is of relevance, right? And it's a laying down of a world, a laying down of a relevant Umwelt. So to my mind, a kind of charitable way of interpreting what he's trying to get at here is to say, we have a process of individuation, maybe with Simondon we would say now, right? There's some coherence, some process that, generates its own existence. Because of that, it is precarious. Its existence depends on what it's doing. And because of that, things matter to this process, right? So we have the kind of like the basic ingredients of the enactive approach in this paragraph. It's trying to explain why things matter and why there's a perspective of concern to the world in terms of the precariousness of a process of individuation of an individual. And if you think about it that way, then this gives us an opportunity to reinterpret what he means with laying down of relevant Umwelt. A better expression, I think, is he says a world becomes specified. All right, that's different. That's not saying a world becomes created, right? It becomes specified. It becomes specific. And that I can totally subscribe to. That makes total sense to me, right? And the way I would put it in more modern terms is with Alva Noe. A world shows up, right? That doesn't mean I created the world, right? But I put down the conditions for it to show up to me as present, okay? And that's a very, very different way of talking than just saying, it's a kind of, consistency relationship. No, it's not a consistency relationship. It's something I'm making contact with, right? And that's why it shows up. All right, moving on. So he has these 3 points that he wants to make in terms of the kind of shift that he's after. One is the characterization, going from input-output to operational closure and eigenbehavior. And by the way, he says operational closure here rather than organizational closure, which is a terminological shift that has sometimes been debated, but let's just treat it as the same here. My question here is that is this an epistemological shift only, right? Is this just a way of us external observers of asking different kinds of questions from the systems that we study? Or are we trying to, and get a more fundamental, a deeper shift going here? The modes of relationship, instructive one, laying down a sense, we have to be careful again. Are these both thought of in terms of internalism, or is the second one going towards a relational direction? And then mode of inference, going from underlying objectivity to bracketing objectivity. So, this is one of his concerns that he also expressed with his work with Maturana, that if we allow representationalism, that then allows appeals to objectivity, which, seems to suggest that you have some kind of authority over what is reality, right? So the preferred way of undoing that, echoing some of the previous things we have discussed in this seminar series, is to say, let's bracket objectivity. But if you do it too simple, which in this case might be a little bit, too direct. If you negate objectivity, then one nonsensical position yields another nonsensical position. And I think that this is where shifting to a meta level is actually the more preferred options. Let's not just, flip the coin on the other side. We're looking for something actually fundamentally different. And to some extent, he himself, has this sense. So, he says Turing is very useful, but we need to develop the other tools. Actually, so it's just an appeal to say, look, there are other things out there, and we need to find them. We need to find the best tools for the job. He has the example of the immune system here, and there's some interesting, work here that will be discussed later on in the seminar series. I just have an interesting phrase to me is the rest is simply nonsense. So he, distinguishes between self and nonsense. And we can see it already in the previous quote where he was talking about background noise, right? It's it's the individual and everything else is just background noise. It's the self, the immune self, and everything else is just nonsense. And interestingly, when I was talking with John Stewart about his work with Varela about immune systems, and I asked him, so what happened there? He told me that they eventually found out that the reality was different. That actually it didn't quite work as expected, and that's partially why they then move into other areas. There's some interesting work on that if you're interested to look into it. Okay. The quality of laying down a sense is not given by what you give, but by the structure of the system. So this is the doctrine of structured determinism that we also find in Maturana and Varela earliest work. And maybe nowadays we would call it state determinism. And again, for me, it's too one-sided. I think that we need to be careful here. So we should allow for the possibility that the world itself is also involved in the process of sense making. What we're aiming for is a world involving account. It's not all just internal determination. All right, so we're already ending his paper here. So he says, my main point today is that I'm convinced that we need to understand that autonomous mechanisms are fundamentally different from Turing Cartesian ones, right? So how different is the conclusion to this paper compared to the previous paper, where he was, comparing, in almost favorable terms, his idea of organizational closure, the closure thesis, with the church thesis. But like I said, it's one thing to say it, that you don't think that the Turing Cartesian ones are the right ones, but how much has his own framework evolved and actually to allow him to say these things? And this is where I think that, that he aimed for more than the theory at that time actually allowed him to do. So if we see, for example, in the Embodied Mind, the chapter on Vittorio, this artificial life system that kind of recursively generates interesting patterns. There's some debate recently about that actually, is a way of showing that the enactive approach is compatible with certain forms of computationalism. And that might sound surprising, but then again, if you go back to these early papers, you see maybe it's not that surprising, right? That's exactly where these inspirations come from to some extent. And I think that part of what we're seeing in these papers is Varela's own dissatisfaction with that, as he wants to bring in more experience, more lived experience, more phenomenology into his research project, but doesn't yet have the tools to properly do them justice. And so with that, there's a discussion here. Let me just pick out a couple of things. So it's quite interesting to see this debate happening. So someone says, I'm not sure if the Turing machine is really a very good example for what you mean, because it can run things autonomously. And the Turing machine is indeed structure determined too. We can think of it as operationally closed. And he just responds, we're not talking about the same thing, right? And then, the guy says, but in engineering, you can have autonomous system. And so I think partially, this misunderstanding of when he says, we're not talking about the same thing, I just want to enlarge the scope. What's going on here is that people are picking up on this and saying, hey, your framework is to some extent not fundamentally different from some of the things that we can say in computationalism. And that's kind of true, as we saw it in his previous paper, right? So this person in the audience, to some extent, was actually onto something. But we can see Varela's impatience with this, right? And he wants to move somewhere else. But at that point in time, I don't think it was, made yet explicit exactly where the difference lies. Then there's Beer responding to him. And saying, hey, can we make a bridge here between the two things you have distinguished, the control versus the autonomy perspective? And Varela says, no, I don't think so. Again, quite categorical. Once you confront a system, you have to make a choice. That is, as far as I can tell, always all or none, right? And then I'm just asking, what happened to not one, not two? Why can't we not find a more complex relationship here that would allow both perspectives, right? So we have external versus internal determination, as I put on my comment on the left, of internal activity. That's where the debate of autonomy versus control is at, right? Does the determination of internal activity come from the inside or does it come from the outside, right? But why not both, right? That's the relational point of view. Why not say that both external and internal determination of relation activity in a brain-body world system, the kind of thing that we're doing in a dynamical systems approach nowadays, where we're just treating the brain and the body and the environment as one whole system, and all of these systems, parts of the system, are contributing to the behavior, and the behavior is a relational property of that entire system. So he says maybe in some future, somebody will find a clever way to actually finding some solid complementarity. So, I think that it shows again, he's aware that we need a better way of thinking about it. Let me see. One other kind of side note that I found curious is that when talking about information, he's now quite dismissive of the notion of information and says that he would rather not use it. And instead, he wants to talk about the quality of a system to endow the world with a certain regular relationship, which then tells you that that item has meaning. So, I'm allergic to pollen. So if this, meaning has to do with certain regular relationships, then to my mind, that's almost saying like, we have something like a sensory motor contingency theory that, has been developed more recently. So the quality of the interaction, the experience, the lived quality of the interaction is determined by the kind of regularities that the interaction exhibits. And finally, there's this debate between Wiener and von Neumann. I don't want to go into the interpretations here of who is right about, who was the more, computationalist or something like that. But it's interesting what Varela was trying to move away from, right? He didn't like that von Neumann, in his mind, was always trying to make it technological and precise and computable, right? This kind of determinism. And for him, Wiener stands for values and a non-separation between value and research. So to my mind, this is the key issue here, actually. And I think that we're still struggling with this today. And so I think it's a good point to leave it at this point here. If we think of the problem being that when we have something that is too precise, too computable, or too deterministic, too complete, if the problem then is that we cannot capture anymore the full phenomenology of the living, then we have a problem, right? Because dynamical systems theory is all of that, right? It's not just computational. Dynamical systems theory is technological, it's precise, it's computable, right? So if the problem lies there, then actually we need a completely different formalism. And dynamical systems theory is not going to be sufficient to allow us to do a science of subjectivity in the fullest sense of the term. All right, so I'll leave it there, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tom, for this interesting presentation / reflection. We've covered quite a lot of ground, and you've pointed out, I think, some really important questions and issues that can be found in these papers, especially as they pertain to Francisco's later works. At this point, I will slowly move us towards the question and answer period. So again, to all of you, feel free to pose your questions in the general chat. I've already received some, both in the private and the general chat. I will start with a fairly general question, and it is more or less a synopsis or a synthesis of sorts of several questions that I've received, and also one that I'm interested in. And that is the question, given the fact that you yourself are working in the field of autonomous systems broadly construed, okay, very broadly construed. The question would be, what in your would be the reason that the input-output systems or the input-output system approach seems to be still, in a certain sense, more prevalent and has a more, let's say, commonsensical appeal? And I would relate this question to two sub-questions, which are, as you will see, basically closely related. And the first one is by Enea, who said that precisely what I've just said. So why is this the case? Why this still seems to be the reason, even, for example, when there are these new methods and new ways of conceptualizing systems. And the second subsection or part of this question would be the one posed by Fabian. How do these approaches sit with, say, ecological and evolutionary approaches, which seem to somehow pose a problem to autonomous systems? And maybe that might be the reason why they are kind of overlooked, or maybe why they receive lesser attention.
All right. Yeah, so I mean, first, I think one of the reasons why I'm so, let's say, sensitive to this issue is because working with robotics and AI and computational systems for so much of my career, it becomes quite clear that they're just not like living beings. And for someone who's maybe a bit more distant from the field of AI and robotics, and gets more, in touch with them through science fiction or movies or the media or something like that, you might get a sense that they're actually much more human-like and lifelike than they actually are. But when you look behind the scenes, when the cameras are not looking, and you see them falling over and doing all kinds of, completely mechanical failures and breakdowns, then you see that there's no sense making there. But then the question is, of course, like, why don't we have an alternative project? And that is a very good question. And I think what this going through these papers again revealed to me is that I think we're still waiting for the next big breakthrough. I think that to some extent, if we talked about how Varela relates this idea of organizational closure to Newtonian dynamics and classical physics and so on. But we still use the same formalism of dynamical systems theory now, right? But as I said in the last slide, if really the issue here is that the kind of like complete determinism specification that this formalism imposes on systems, by definition, to some extent, rules out the spontaneous subjective part of those systems, then we still haven't actually made any progress on these fundamental issues. And so it's nice that we're bringing this up, because I think especially for the current generation of people who are working in the enactive approach, I think there's a sense of, maybe we need to move forward into new directions. And and it's something that is still, pointing towards the future. I think we need to find ways of doing science that doesn't rely on dynamical systems theory. Right, and which way that science will head towards is still an open question. But yeah, I think at the very least, we need to start thinking of nature and biology specifically as fundamentally incomplete and as fundamentally non-deterministic. And once you accept that, then your choice of tools becomes very limited, and that's part of the problem.
This question of determinacy and indeterminacy is very interesting, and I think very relevant for today's discussion. But before we go into that, I would like to ask a somewhat related question, the one that you also mentioned in your presentation / reflection, namely, what happens with this not one, not two, when it comes to these seemingly opposite ways of construing a system. So, for instance, Marijke sent me a question where she asks whether we might not, after all, find a way to bridge these two seemingly separate approaches. And this ties in nicely with a question that was sent to me by Adnan, namely, there are instances where one type of system can be nested in another. For example, computers can emulate autonomous systems. For example, a digital computer can emulate something like a game of life. And then autonomous systems can act or behave as input-output systems sometimes, for example, in very specific laboratory settings. So the question might be, is there a way maybe of construing, let's say, a broader star or a new star, as Varela would put it, where these two might somehow be part of the very same star without necessarily contradicting contradicting each other?
Yeah, so I mean, in my working life as a working scientist who has to deal with technology and models and so on, I have to somehow justify it to myself why I'm still working with those things. And what I do is to say that I'm just modeling very specific periods of time. So let's say you're just decided to run and you're falling into a behavioral pattern. From that point onwards, we can quite nicely describe how the system will behave until you get to the next decision point, until there's something shifts again in the system and it starts doing something else. But as long as we're in these pockets of stability, we can characterize it quite nicely with the tools that we have, dynamical systems theory, basically. And so it is indeed like a generalization to a larger star, if you want, would be to say, there are these phenomena, right? And some of these phenomena at some times can be described as dynamical deterministic systems, right? So, and then some of those, going back deeper in, can be described as functions, recursive functions, to go like into the earlier paper. So we're kind of like adding layers and layers, but it's important that in order to be able to add this outer layer, where we're talking about non-determinism, we're clear that the layer of dynamical systems is not a complete one, right? So if our worldview of the universe of reality is like a clockwork universe, then we've basically lost, right? Then we can't add another layer on the outer edges of that. So already somehow the worldview that revolves around the dynamical system one has to be explicitly acknowledged as being a partial one. And then once we have done that step, once we are in agreement on that point, then we're in a good position to explore what else is there and what else do we want to explore. But if you think about the way in which the whole dynamical approach to cognitive science has been traditionally framed in its competition with computationalism, that's not really what it's at stake, right? Both of those usually agree that things are state determined. The universe is state determined, basically, a state determined system. Right? It's like this classic box universe, where even time to some extent is just, a predetermined trajectory. So really what we need to do as a community is say, that's not what we're buying in terms of our worldview. We need to get into metaphysics and say, hey, in order to make this work, we have to reject this particular metaphysics, which says that, the reality is a state determined system. And once we have done that, then we are like in a new regime where we can start asking questions about, okay, so what's missing from that worldview? How do we want to enrich it? But like the move to that, I think is still highly controversial, and I think even many of my closer colleagues would be very hesitant to make it. So it's still something very much in the air.
Thank you. Would anybody perhaps want to add any comment to this, just to finding a middle ground or a middle way, or a way to conceptualize, say, systems that would not fall into any of the two extremes? Because in general, I've received quite a lot of questions that somehow address this particular, let's say, neurologic point in what has been presented today. So let's say the radical subjectivism of, say, radical version of constructivism on the one hand, and then the possibility of falling into the pit of radical determinism in some version of, say, radical orthodox realism. And one question, there are several questions here, and there's one that I would like to ask you. Namely, I've been reading this book. Some of you probably have heard of it. It's by Ilya Prigogin and Isabel Stengers, Order Out of Chaos. It's a classic. But there's this notion of dissipative structures who apparently are in principle indeterministic. So you can have systems that behave in a way that is in principle indeterministic. So I was just wondering, whether these developments in the field of thermodynamics and how they apply to chemistry and biology might somehow be useful to move the discussion in the direction that you've mentioned.
Yeah, I think one way to clarify this is to say we have to be careful not to confuse non-determinism with, let's say, non-predictability, something like that. So a system can be chaotic and non-predictable and yet still be deterministic. So if you had a program that was chaotic, then, without running it and seeing what happens, you wouldn't know what would happen. But if you then went back to the initial conditions, the same identical conditions, and you would run it again, you would know what would happen. So in that sense, it's still deterministic. There's no freedom there. There's no degree of freedom where the system would then spontaneously do something else. It's just that in practice, if you didn't run it first, you wouldn't be able to predict how it would end up. So non-determinism is something stronger than that. It really means that even if you were to return to the same initial conditions, you would get something else out in the end. And the only physics that allows that to happen, but fortunately it exists, is quantum physics. So ever since the quantum physics revolution, we know that nature at its most fundamental level is non-deterministic, right? And that's not just purely for epistemological reasons or practical reasons, that maybe with better instrumentation in the future, we would be able to recover determinism at that level. It's actually an in principle kind of thing. So funnily enough, so Varela appeals to classical physics, right? He explicitly so in this 81 paper. It seems like the kind of physics that we need to appeal to in order to move this debate in the direction that he would have wanted is actually quantum physics. Because in quantum physics, there is genuine possibility for unexpected change, for unexpected events to happen. Unexpected in the sense that they're not already determined by preceding causal events. And I think that's really a strong notion of autonomy. If you want to make room for subjectivity as such to make a difference in how our behavior unfolds, that means to some extent that it cannot be fully determined, the behavior cannot be fully determined by preceding events. If it is, then there's no room for anything else to make a difference, right? That's kind of like with the not one, not two paper. If we are identical to our bodies, right? If the subject is identical to the physical body, that would be, determinism. There's no room for the subjective experience to make a difference for how things unfold. So in order to make that room, we have to basically assume a physics which has some conceptual space in which we cannot say what will happen next based on everything that happened previously. But fortunately, that exists at the level of quantum physics. Of course, then there's the question of how do we scale that up, right? I'm not talking about, some crazy consciousness here of microtubules or something like that. That's just kind of like a proof of concept. In nature, there is such thing. Now, how could it happen at the level of whole organisms? That's an open question. But actually, at that point, something like chaos might even come to the rescue, because chaos famously is sensitive to its initial conditions. So an infinitely small change in its initial condition can have macroscopic effects down the line. The famous butterfly effect. Butterfly flaps its wings, suddenly a hurricane, starts emerging somewhere else, right? And so these initial conditions can be so small, they can be even undetectable, in principle, immeasurable. And if that's the case, then we can actually scale from quantum physics to macroscopic events in a way that macroscopic event would be undetermined by preceding events. That's just a very broad sketch, but something of that sort might be the thing that we need to work on in order to make room for subjectivity in the universe.
Marvelous. Andreas proposed to add a little bit to this discussion of looking for a middle way.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for this new insight. I'm again, two papers I did not know, so somehow I set in just after this, and it's very enlightening. So thanks for presenting this and the ensuing questions. And I think actually what we are asking ourselves, or what Sebastjan you're emphasizing in asking, is what Francisco asked himself. So he was actually looking for the middle way, for the third way, and then even the book which he did with Evan and Elena Roche was called that had that title. And I think I'm very sympathetic with what you said, Tom, about pulling in the already quantum physics and with all which it entails. But I think Francisco's search was going into a different direction, and I find this is still not really anchored in our scientific picture. And this was to emphasize more and more the non-abstractable realization of autonomy and inexperiencedness. And I really see in what he's writing in this beautiful sequence of these historical papers I never looked at before, how he tries to find answers to a question he doesn't even really know how to pose from the prevailing paradigms. So I think now, as several of you asked, how could we pull this back into science? I think we really have to invite lived subjectivity, even our lived subjectivity, as an instrument of doing science. And you see now Western science then becomes very complicated. And I think what Francisco was doing on the other side of his personality, namely his Buddhist side, was just this. So he was just exploring the third way from the inside, in a way. And then he was also trying to put all this together in his later writing. And I think this is still pertinent. And it's and what he found there is that organisms have this non-reducible inner experience, which is the experience of autonomy. And then in some respect, he stopped trying to abstract autonomy in this more formalistic way and started to work with this experience of autonomy. And I think he really has a point. And this is missing from the whole scientific endeavor. It's the experience of lived autonomy. And so I'd really say, if we're looking for a third way, then it includes to put our own lived subjectivity into the game. But that changes Western science, and that's a big thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. One of the things that was in my mind while I was working through these papers was your comment in the previous seminar that you feel like we see Varela like having this insight that hey, experience is important, and it's actually the background of everything that we do. And then that kind of like he works through that as his scientific career progresses. And I think that's what we're seeing in these papers. It's like making separations, right? So hey, I'm not doing that, right? And and then the next paper says, I'm now realizing I'm not even doing this either, right? So it's kind of like negating frameworks that he feels to be in tension with this overarching research program. So it's a kind of like making progress by negating things that don't work, kind of way, and then seeing where that leads. I think it's a really interesting way of reading these papers.
And this explains the seeming contradiction you point to, because he needs to distance himself from certain positions, although he is educated in these positions and somehow uses them as well for his argument. So I think that very much explains why he this kind of paradoxical struggle we are seeing, what you just said, and that he has something on the horizon, but it's just not explicable in what he tries to use to argue for.
Yeah, good point. And sometimes people complain that his writings were not clear enough, and it has these kinds of tensions and so on. But it's interesting to see that in the discussion in this last paper, he explicitly says, I'm doing this as an expositional device. I don't really care about exactly what Wiener said or what Neumann said, or what the historians of science say about them. I want to make an argument, and I'm using them as players in order to enact this argument, right? And if we get that sense of that's his style of thinking through problems, then I think a lot of his more later work also makes sense from that. Sometimes we're looking at it from a philosophical point of view, and then like almost trying to go through it. But a lot of it has more to do with this playful, expositional sense of doing things.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. And I mean, it was really this huge dynamics of searching for something which is somehow just over the horizon. And so, some very important works in the history of philosophy have this warning at the beginning. So I'm tackling this, and what I'm writing here is only provisional. For example, yesterday I read with my seminar the Kandinsky's theoretical work on the spiritual in art, and he says this: it's only a minor work, it's only provisional, and this is so it's also a little bit unclear, you know, and then it becomes this seminal work. I think it's a little bit like this, but then it leaves the traces of a search, and that's what you highlighted so clearly. And I think it's just this: it's a search. It's really a path laid down in walking, actually.
Yeah, I think so. I think we can see his thinking in action, basically.
Yeah.
You know, his thinking in the writing. Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this very interesting and illuminating exchange. Moving or going back to the neurologic point that I mentioned, which was more or less the question about externalism and internalism, as you phrased it, Tom. I saw that you were quite cautious there to avoid the idealism versus realism, which is, I think, probably a good move. I would maybe ask Timotej if he could ask his question, because it would seem that he pretty much nails the how do you say it on the head. You know, it's kind of it's on the spot. It's on the spot, and it kind of summarizes the issue, and we can then maybe go to some of other suggestions and questions that were posed in relation to this.
Okay.
Okay, hello. Thank you for the interesting talk. I think you might have already partly at least answered my question, but it has to do with like the two basic tenets I see in maybe Varela's work, and also maybe second order cybernetics in general. So the first one would be like, one has to take into account one's own action as a modeler, as a constructing a model. So you could say that the boundary and the structure of observed phenomena is a function of your own activity as a scientist, as a modeler, right? And the second tenet would be almost a kind of a reversal of this, which is to say that autonomous systems construct their own boundaries, their own structures. So that there seems to be a kind of a realism entailed in this second tenet. So at least I could read this as a kind of almost a very radical ontological realism. And thinking of this, what would this mean for the first tenet? So how would you read the first one, which I take as at least it usually read along very radical constructivist lines, as a kind of a constructivist epistemology.
Right. Yeah. I think actually, yeah, pointing to. So the constructivist has an easy game when all you're constructing is objects, right? But when it comes to constructing other people, then things get difficult, right? And that's not for nothing, because as you said, that when we distinguish living systems in the right kind of way, they appear as autonomous or autopoietic, which means that they appear as self-distinguishing. And that's nice, because it's a kind of undoing, of our own distinction, right? We make a distinction, but then we realize this system doesn't need our distinction, right? It's doing its own distinction. So all I'm doing with my distinction is reading the fact that the other system is actually distinguishing itself. And I think that's kind of like, where realism comes in, actually. That's the strongest argument that we can make. And it reminds me a little bit of, the phenomenological tradition where we talk about the transcendence of the other, right? So again, like we are presented with the otherness of the other, and the otherness is kind of like, presented as going beyond our grasp, right? We can't collapse the other subjectivity into our own consciousness. And that really defines the otherness of the other, that it goes beyond our experience and beyond our control and beyond what we can know, this opaqueness, right? And we, interestingly enough, with this kind of experiential givenness of the other, which kind of like grounds, the notion of reality in phenomenology, is what we see when we, talk about autopoietic systems, right? So we basically also find this transcendence of the living system in the sense that they are distinguishing themselves, and thereby going beyond our own distinction that we make of them.
Thank you, Tom. This maybe a very quick comment on this question of constructivism and realism. So from my readings of Francisco's works, it would seem that he found something very powerful and useful in the constructivist traditions, because they emphasized or underscored the contribution that the living being somehow makes in constituting, bringing forth, co-constituting, instituting reality in one way or another. And I think that at the very beginning of his journey, it would seem that the constructivist tradition in general, particularly the second order cybernetics, was something that was most well known to him. Afterwards, when he kind of discovered, in a certain sense, the phenomenological tradition, it would seem that he realized that he doesn't really need such a powerful concept as construction to emphasize what he was aiming at. And this has also some textual basis. Namely, Varela published a paper together with Glasersfeld, who is probably one of the most well-known radical constructivist thinkers. And I read an interview with Glasersfeld that was published after that publication, and where Glasersfeld said, yeah, you know, I was working together with Varela, but he doesn't seem to be that interested in constructivism anymore, so I don't really know what he's doing right now. So, you know, this shift or move away from the notion of radical constructivism seems to coincide with him discovering phenomenological authors who allow you to talk about constitution, institution, and things, similar notions, without necessarily going on the other, so to the other extreme, away from realism to some version of radical constructivism. Konrad and Andreas have in the chat mentioned, you know, possible solutions along these lines of the question of externalism and internalism. And Konrad mentioned that maybe one way to get away from this distinction might be to contextualize it. So maybe, Konrad, if you ask the question.
Yes, hi. Thank you for this great talk. So it's hard to say anything more substantial in just one question. So my remark was just, we can make the distinction between, well, instead of getting rid of the distinction between the internal and the external, we can make it more contextual. So, for example, we can say that the nervous system draws the boundary in one way, and let's say the immune system draws this boundary in a different way, and perhaps some other system draw this boundary in yet another way. So I wonder what you think about this option, and perhaps our behavior draws this boundary in yet another way. So we have behavioral patterns drawing boundaries, the immune system drawing boundaries, and we have, let's say, a family of the internal versus external boundary. I've been trying to construe some sort of ontology of boundaries, as you may know, as you may remember in my adaptive behavior paper. So I'm struggling with this issue, and I wonder what you think about it.
Yes, thank you. So I think that I agree with that. There are definitely lots of different kinds of boundaries at play, and some of them will be inside the organism. Some will coincide with the outer boundary of the organism, and some will go into the environment. I think that's true, and I think that you know, in some cases, when the definition is broad enough, you know, processes that, you know, contribute to the self-generation of the network of processes, it becomes quite evident that we need to include behavior, adaptive behavior, in that list, right? You know, if you're an organism that needs food to survive, but you're not allowed to eat, well, you're gonna die, right? So it's already at that level, we can't exclude ways of interacting with the environment as being part of these networks of processes. So, you know, the internal external distinction starts to break down quite quickly. Just one kind of, like, you know, concern, and it has to do with this question about the other that Timotej raised, and that is that not everything should go, right? So when we talk about all these different systems creating boundaries, we should still have some sort of operational criteria that tell us that the boundaries that are being created here are to some extent self-determined or self-created, and not just boundaries that we arbitrarily drew around a set of variables.
If I can just jump in for one more remark. I think that it's, let's say, it's an old-fashioned remark that can only be made by a philosopher. Namely, we need some ontology of boundaries, or a metaphysics of boundaries, if you like, but I prefer to call it ontology of boundaries. And then we can resolve these different conceptual, very abstract issues regarding boundaries. So, and just one funny thing about boundaries is that they separate and they connect at the same time, or they can play these two functions. So if you think just some, I know, take any simplistic example, let's say the boundary between two parts of my shirt, it separates these parts and at the same time it connects them. So this ontology of boundaries can contribute to the change that we should, according to your own words, that we should make when it comes to the metaphysics or the ontology of the mind-world relationship in general. So we have this idea that it's not about representation, it's not about adaptation, but it perhaps should be more about connection of things like this. So I guess that
I completely agree. I hear what you're saying, and those are exactly the kind of ideas that I also like to play with. So one way I think about boundaries and that moves away from this internalism, externalism dichotomy is as interfaces, right? So there are ways through which we relate, and another way of thinking about it is as the ways in which we make contact. And I like this because this brings up, for example, Dreyfus' notion of realism, which is not a representational realism, right? We're making contact with the world. And I think that's a very nice way of thinking about this.
Okay, next comment, Natalie, it seems to be related.
Yes, it was. I was just thinking, because it fits exactly in what you were talking about, this necessity to both to distinguish and to connect. And I think we have in Francisco's very late papers a very nice way to formulate this in the terms of the fold. He uses this word, the fold. He takes it from, I think, from Gilles Deleuze work on Leibniz, but he makes it its own way of expressing the fold of the paper, where you have the mark of the distinction, but still the connection between the two papers. When the same paper but being folded. So it's a very concrete way of embracing, I mean, this, well, what could seem to be a contradiction between distinction and unity, but with this word, you already have the organic way of expressing it. And I think it's a very nice way of dealing with this issue in a very simple and concrete way as well. So I just wanted to add this to the discussion, because I think it's well.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I completely agree with you, and it's nice that you remind me of the notion of the fold. I think it actually goes hand in hand with what I said about, you know, the natural. The dynamical systems goes back to Newton, right? But you know, we now know that the universe is not just Newtonian, right? It's also quantum. And like in neurophenomenology, on the one hand, still appeals to dynamical system theory, and it appeals to Husserlian phenomenology. But also in philosophy, we've moved forward, right? So we have the whole post-structuralist movement. We can talk about, you know, Merleau-Ponty's chiasm. We can talk about Deleuze's fold and bring these notions into play. And I think we should do that much more than has been done so far.
Mm-hmm. Because just to add, I think they're not only metaphors. I think they're really working expressions from the language, and well, it's very much in the spirit of Francisco's way of dealing with generativity and expression as being the in the language itself. And so it's well, a good way to also to avoid a too strong distinction between metaphor and concept, and we know now that it's difficult to stick to this distinction as well. So
yes, thank you.
Andreas, you had a comment or?
Yes, which becomes richer and richer through all these layers which sediment right now. I'd say relating to Francisco, we should be attentive that he's never talking about metaphors. It's just my little takeaway from what Natalie said. I mean, it's really interesting to see Gilles Deleuze being evoked in his late work because he was clearly working on how sense is realized or meaning is realized as interpretation through a multitude. And I think this is what we just see where Francisco's work is steering to. So it makes total sense for me. And I mean, in the background of this, because it's also a work on Deleuze's work on the fold is on Leibniz. And there's a certain view on the cosmos implied, which means that the single is a function of the whole. So there we have already a relationship between, let's say, the individual and the whole, or the internal and the external, which is something of being separate and connected, as you said, Tom. And actually, it reminded me to that famous phrase by Simone Weil. So now we're in mystic terrain. She said a separation is always a connection. And I think this is probably at work in Francisco's work, and he tried to understand how this can be through the action of organism and as the core of what organism is. And coming back and then ending is relating to what you said, so how he somehow got rid of the constructive notion. I think in my time in his lab, actually he said he wasn't a constructivist. I think I had this kind of typical exchange with him when in my naivete, I called his work constructivist. And I said, no. Now I tell you something. It's really not longer the case. So he went from constructive to interpretative. And in this is all the idea of mutual specification, which he writes about in this in the third way. But that interpretative means that that meaning is the experience of the other in terms of self, and they're inextricable, and also the other way around, the self in terms of other, and so both dimensions are in one hand a realization of the ongoing process of self, but on the other hand they are also real. So they're real because they are embodied, they're material. So they're real, but they're not graspable. And then we are back at Deleuze again, because as you know, Deleuze is not about talking about objective separations. It's all very fluid. And so I in my work, I come to call this realism poetic objectivity, as it's always expressive, it's always interpretive, but it's still about something which is shared and existing and which can be destroyed. So it has both sides. And that's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think then we're pretty much on the same page, and then it's nice to discuss this as a community. I think we're pretty much all agreed, at least in this community, that the shift from constructivism to this interpretation, hermeneutic, or enactive framework in its initial form was the right move, partially because it allows us to reconnect with the world and reconnect with others. But as you said, I think in the kind of traditional hermeneutics, there's still the sense that it's a kind of relativism, right? And in which, it's a kind of state determinism almost, right? It's like the meaning is what I make out of it, and it's almost independent of what's out there. And it's quite nice that you kind of you push back on that a little bit with your notion of poetic objectivity, and I think that's exactly where I want to head to. I want to be able to say, hey, yeah, we're making contact with something that goes beyond my experience of it, and yet, of course, I will always experience it from my perspective, right? And neither of these two should be given up, right? It's the world presents itself, right? Yeah. And so there's the world, and then there's how it presents itself. There's what it is and how it is, right? And I think moving towards an enactivism that really takes that as its core way of thinking about how we relate to the world is very healthy. And it's good because it'll make the scientists more happy, right? Because suddenly there's a world that they can talk about. It's not just interpretations anymore. It's not just constructivist projections anymore, right? So they can be happy and say, hey, yeah, of course, we're studying the world, right? But I also think it's very healthy for the humanities and social sciences, because once you had postmodernism, getting rid of all narratives and all objectivity and everything goes, then suddenly, what are values anyway? Everything just becomes just whatever you want it to be. And I think that's not the place where we want to be. And when we start facing the crisis that, the world needs to face, right? We need to have some grounding for our notions. And so we need the world. And I think, so this nice play between these two domains, if Enaction can make that link between the world, the natural world of science, and say, yep, there's something there, but then also, give something to the humanities and social sciences and say, hey, values are also real and we need them, and they're part of what the world is for us. That's that's exactly what we need in order to move forward.
Thank you very much, Tom, for this rich answer. Maybe I would just add here something along the lines of what Konrad said, namely that what you've just said resonates with me, for instance, very much. The thing is, however, that I think that most scientists and even people in the enactivist community underestimate the radicality of the change that the notion of the world would have to undergo if what you've just said and what has just been said will be taken on board. Because yes, we arrive at a certain world, but this world is a pretty different world from the one that is still somehow implicitly presupposed in most of the scientific work. And I think that here work by, say, Merleau-Ponty, Whitehead, and Deleuze also can be extremely useful in reconstruing the notion of the world and how scheme as well. On this note, I will have to end this meeting today because Tom said that he has time. Well, we're already 8 minutes past that time. So unfortunately,
let me just come back to that. It's too fascinating to stop talking, and I talk for an hour. So and we don't have so much chance to meet each other anymore, and so it feels like if we can actually agree on some of the things that we're discussing right now, I think then this seminar will have made an important contribution to the evolving ideas of enactivism. So. Let me just talk about the notion of the world a little bit, and I completely hear you, and it will be a radical change of what is the world that we're talking about. But in some sense, it'll be kind of like a healing experience to just realize that the world that is that we perceive is the world. I think there's something liberating about having to stop trying to look for the world somewhere else other than the world that we're in right now. And yet, of course, somehow we have to fit that in with the best physics that we have. And there, I think that, they have the problem that they need to somehow fit the observer into the universe, right? So it's not like that they're completely like saying, independent of what we're talking about right now. They have that problem too. And, the observer was relatively easy to be incorporated when it was Einstein, and it was just a relative shift of a perspective frame. But when it came to quantum physics and knowledge and actions and historical contingencies started to make a difference to how experiments were going to turn out, then suddenly it was not so easy anymore. And of course, most physicists recently have tried to work around that and tried to come up with formalisms that avoid any kind of relationship to the observer. But it's still open question, right? And if anybody can make a contribution there and say, hey, now I've understood why this is so, I think that, that will make a big contribution.
Sebastjan, now you know what our true mission is.
Yeah.
And I mean, Tom, when you just say, I'm just abusing your time abuse a little bit more. And when you say, when you mention the observer, I mean, it's crazy when they're really trying to minimize the observer in their pictures. It's just totally counter science, actually. Some are totally against what they did in the last 100 years. But I mean, the word observer is wrong, as we all know. It should be participant. It's just wrong.
Completely agree. Love
it doesn't
it.
exist.
Yeah.
It's a fiction.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So as soon as we adopt a world involving metaphysics, then quantum physics doesn't seem so strange anymore, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Right. And that's the key. You know, once you understood that, then pieces start falling into place very nicely.
Yeah.
And by the way, like if you look at some of the philosophers, theoretical physicists who work in quantum physics, so there's Smolin. I've been reading his work quite a bit recently, and in his recent book, Einstein's Unfinished Revolution, he starts it by saying basically that he is his brain, more or less. That, oh, how wondrous is it that there are these stimulus that get processed by the eyes and then processed in the brain, and that's how you can observe the universe, right? So let's just imagine that we replace his internal starting point with a world involving starting point. How would the book then unfold from that point onward? It would be a completely different starting point. And really what he wants to do is argue for realism in quantum physics, because for him, realism is a kind of ethical choice. He wants to be able to make space for other people and our actions making a difference and things like that, which I think we're all on board with that project, right? But he tries to do it with an internalist representationist point of view, and then that gets him into trouble with quantum physics, right? So if we can give him instead a world involving view of realism, who knows, maybe that's exactly what he would be looking for in order to ground a new view of physics. So I think there's really a huge potential, actually, of our community of reaching out to physics and saying, hey, you probably haven't heard of us, but our notion of what observation actually amounts to will be very useful for you and probably could solve some of the issues that you're facing.
That's very interesting.
This is marvelous. I would just like to add here, and I'm pretty sure that Gabor would appreciate this, that, for instance, I've been lately delving into Whitehead's processual philosophy again, and it's just incredible how rich his ideas and notions are, were and have been and are, and how strongly they resonate, for instance, with some of the ideas of later Merleau-Ponty. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because you have authors who have been developing alternative ontologies and alternative ways of thinking without necessarily trying to kind of shove aside scientific endeavor. Quite to the contrary, very much they were developing these ideas very much in line with the science and with the recent developments of sciences, saying that basically if we take these on board and if we develop their implications to the utmost limits, we will basically arrive to something as a processual ontology that we need to reconceptualize temporality and so on and so forth. Maybe Gabor can also add something.
Yes, absolutely. I also wanted to mention at one point that Whitehead's process philosophy or organic philosophy or ontology can indeed be a good candidate to investigate further, although it was developed in the 1920s in Process and Reality and Science and the Modern World and Adventures of Ideas and other similar books. He was a mathematician writing with Russell on Principia Mathematica, but he became a philosopher of nature or naturalist philosopher, I would say, developing an ontology that includes the subjective perspective very deeply.
So unfortunately, I don't know enough about Whitehead, but let me tell you one of the reasons why I haven't been more interested in exploring it. And that is that, the idea that you have lots of individuals, including, in physics, which to some extent are, subjects in their own right, which then gives a kind of panpsychist view of what's going on in the universe, doesn't feel comfortable to me. So on the one hand, I prefer to do it with Jonas and go subjectivity all the way to the origins of life, but not before life. But also there's another reason. So if we want to have subjectivity in the world, there is an easier way now, where we are at now, to introduce it rather than assigning it to individuals that are non-organic. And that is, again, just to say, we're involved in the world. The world participates in our experience and we participate in the world. And if that's the case, right, if we adopt a world involving ontology, that means to some extent panpsychism is true, but not because there's lots of little consciousnesses everywhere,
exactly.
but just because we're related with the world, because we're involved in the world.
Exactly.
So if Whitehead says that, then I'd be very happy to hear more. But it seems to me that that's not the way he's going.
No, also Whitehead was on a search trip.
He's misunderstood, I think, with the notion of panpsychism. He's misunderstood. He was not talking about panpsychism in that form. That
yes, I agree with that.
He was talking about the ontology of experience and reframing the form or the notion of experience and how we might understand it. And it may go back.
I think that would be an interesting project then to reread him from this world-involving perspective, and then see what happens.
Natalie, you wanted to add something.
Yes, I wanted. Yes, I wanted just to add that I had at one point I had a discussion with Francisco, and he was telling me that if he had more time, he would go into Whitehead. I mean, it was really one of the authors he wanted to go in, and especially his cosmology. And but he knew it was not possible for him given the time. But I think he was ready on this track as well. So it's it's great to hear what you say.
Okay, so at this point, I would, still take into account Tom's original wishes, although he seems to be, he seems to have forgotten his own.
I'm starting to feel a little bit, the tension of talking for almost 2 hours. So yes, maybe we can call it. I was going to say night over here, but morning for you guys.
Yeah, call it a day, just in general. I would just like to kindly remind you that we have a Discord channel. So if you'd be interested in pursuing these debates further, you're more than warmly welcome to join the channel and continue them there. In 2 weeks, we meet at the regular time. So that's 6 p.m. This was an exception. So please note that down. Tom, thank you again so much for a very, very interesting, illuminating presentation and reflection, and also for these interesting and intriguing answers in the debate.
Thank you also because it's participation, right? I couldn't go fly that high if I wasn't being supported by all of your very relevant questions. So thank you for allowing me to go to places that many conversations I can't go. So thank you for that.
Yes, and I would also like to thank all the participants for all the interesting questions, for the support and everything. And I'll be seeing you in 2 weeks. Till then, be well.